And, I welcome you all. My name is Manu Sopti. I'm the chair of this particular session, paper session B3, titled Indigenous and Cultural Landscapes. And I have the pleasure to be introducing the speakers um, and giving a little summary about what they do, and then leaving you with their titles of their presentations, and they will take it from there. But just a little word of advice. We are giving each speaker 20 minutes. Uh, Given the fact that we only have three speakers today, I'm talking about different time zones. I think we can afford to be a little bit more flexible, and I will be as discreet as possible, as I've told to the speakers. I will not use any antics to make them stop talking. But I do have the yellow screen and the red screen. The yellow screen is to tell you that there are 3 minutes left before 20 minutes are up, and the red screen is about 1 minute left before 20 minutes are left. But we will use it sort of slowly and discreetly, and I will gently ask you to stop, and then we will go to the next speaker. Now, because of the fact that we only have three speakers, I think it might be a good idea to to have all three present and then to do a question answer session. I think that would be the best way to do it. So without further ado, let's move on to our first speaker. Our first speaker is Dr. Ana Sauto. And Dr. Ana Sauto is the postgraduate research tutor and course leader of the professional doctorates in the School of Architecture, Design and Built Environment at Nottingham Trent University. I wish I could be there, but I can't. I was really looking forward to attending in person. Sauto's research interest lies in architecture as a cultural manifestation of memory and identity using participatory methodologies. Her latest work was published in Museum and Society in 2018, titled uh, Experiencing Memory Museums in Berlin, the Otto White Workshop for the Blind Museum and the Jewish Museum Berlin. Anna Sauto Galvan is co-authoring this particular paper with Alexandra Cheretaki, and the title of the paper is Mapping Socio-Spatial Traditions of Contemporary Sacred Landscape. So Anna, the floor is all yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much for such a kind presentation. So I'm going to share my presentation now. Hopefully you can see it. Is it on your screens now?
Yes, we can. Perfect.
Thank you. So yes, this is a work in progress, just to get started. And it is a project that started before COVID, and it has been impacted by COVID, as you can imagine, like many other things. But it is specially designed, and it revolves around the St. Barnabas Cathedral, which is the Catholic cathedral in Nottingham. It was funded by the National Lottery, and NTU was a very important partner in this project. So just to get started, just to give a bit of context of what this project is about. A few years ago, I was asked to be part of the Historic Churches Committee for the Nottingham Roman Catholic Diocese as an architectural historian. And this is a similar institution as English Heritage. So they look at specifically the Catholic heritage in the UK. And it is a very important one because we go through what it is that churches in this country, well, especially in this diocese, need in terms of conservation and preservation of their heritage. And it has been quite clear to me that in the last few years, there are so many churches struggling with their heritage because they don't have enough money or expertise to look after their churches, starting with the roofs, heating, and trying to make them a bit more flexible to be able to be more of a community asset. As a result of this, well, there is a lot of literature looking into what can we do to preserve our churches in the UK, not only Catholic, but other Christian denominations. So as part of this committee, many of us decided to create or apply for this funding application to the National Lottery. And we got a little bit of money, £71,000, to, in principle, the project was called to rediscover Pugin in the cathedral. Nottingham St. Barnabas is quite an important church. It was actually built as a church in 1841, and later on it became a cathedral in 1850. It is listed graded 2 with a star, and it's mostly important because it was designed by Pugin, the father, who was a very important architect to recover the neo-Gothic style in England, and he was really moving the Catholic movement in this country. So many Roman Catholic churches and cathedrals have been built by him. So the project tried to, as I said, rediscover Pugin in St. Barnabas, because as I will show you in a minute, there have been many changes to the aesthetics of the cathedral, especially in interior decoration. But we also wanted to create a 3D scan and 3D modeling of the cathedral, which was very important for us in terms of the future conservation. And as you have heard in other presentations, this is a very important avenue for heritage protection. Also working with Professor Haida Liang, also from NTU, we conducted a number of research experiments with remote scanning to make sure how much of the current decoration is original. We also looked into public engagement activities to try to understand to what extent people understand, well, first of all, know about St. Barnabas Cathedral, to what extent they see its place in the city, how can it be used by others, what is sacredness in our context. And this is the bit that I actually worked more in this project. The cathedral also organized a couple of commemorative events for St. Barnabas, and all this information is helping us now to submit another funding proposal to really look into how we can restore some of the original decorative scheme. So if you see the image on the left hand side, that is meant to be the original status of the painting decoration of St. Barnabas in the 1840s. There is only this painting that we have found. It has been quite difficult to look into the archival information because there have been different changes in the dioceses. So we couldn't find a lot in Birmingham, where most of the information regarding these Catholic churches is. And the archive of the cathedral, unfortunately, is out of bounds because the building is in a really bad state and they are just about to demolish it. So it was very difficult to find a lot of archival information. However, as I will show you in a minute, you will see how the pattern has changed quite drastically. What most experts have been saying over the last few decades is that the bit of the cathedral that remains the most original is the Blessed Sacrament Chapel in the middle. It is very similar to other decorative programs, as you can see in Cheadle, for example, in Stoke-on-Trent, where you can see how Pugin was really looking into all the elements of these Catholic churches, looking at absolutely everything from the architectural design to the interior design and all this decoration, especially painting. So one of the elements, as I mentioned before, Haida Liang's team looked into using the remote Raman system to analyze the different layers within the chapel to investigate, excuse me, to what extent there was still original Pugin. And it's a bit inconclusive, but we think that most, well, certain parts of it are not necessarily original. So that would be something to look into further. This is one of the earliest images we have of the cathedral, and as you can see, it's quite decorative inside, but it also has all these reredos and all the elements that support the decoration of the apsis and the main altar, which through time changes. So, for example, this is around 1940, or during and after the First World War, when the bishop didn't like Pugin's decoration, removed all the decoration in the main altar and created this new altar that other bishops baptized as the wedding cake, because it was very, very ornated. But some of the decoration on the walls you can still see that would be the original Pugin. After that, the main redecoration of the cathedral was in the 1930s by Walters. We don't have color pictures of these, but it was meant to be quite decorative, as you can see on the picture. Then again, in the 90s, a new fashion came into place, and everything was whitewashed, apart from certain walls that went red, as you can see on the image. And the last big renovation of the cathedral was in the 1990s, when they reorganized and reordered the cathedral. And again, it goes into very whitish tones throughout the cathedral. This is an image of the 3D scan that Daniel Anton Garcia realized for us, for the NTU team. And he also created the 3D modeling of the cathedral, which you can access on the YouTube link that I have put here. And we have had another colleague that has been hired, Daniel Hartel Ryan, who is in the who has been working this summer to keep adding texture to the 3D modeling that you will find in YouTube. Now, what I think it is very important in terms of understanding the context for how these churches and cathedrals have survived over time is to look at the census. And we had one very recently this year in 2021. I was very excited about it because I guess I am one of the very few who reads these documents. But I think it's very relevant to understand and analyze society. So in 1851, there was a huge census, religious census, because even though the main church of England is the Anglican Church, there were loads of different denominations, especially from the Methodist Church. Lots of different churches came out of the Methodist. You also had other religions. And what is relevant about the conclusion of this census written by Horace Mann is the fact that if all the inhabitants of England and Wales wanted to go to church, they realized that there was not enough churches, there was not enough room in all the churches at that time in 1851, even though there had been building churches so much, especially after the Industrial Revolution. So on the one hand, the main conclusion is if everybody wants to go to church, there is not enough space for everybody, even though there were many services throughout the day. And the second conclusion is actually not everybody goes to church. So the greatest difficulty is actually to fill the churches when they are actually provided. If we look at the census from 2011, we see a problem that has continued, especially since the 1950s. And you have here two elements on the screen. So, for example, there has been a decrease on people declaring themselves as Christians. In 2001, it was 72% of the population, whilst in 2011, it was only 59%. That goes in contradiction with other numbers. So other religions, for example, Islam or Muslim people increased from 2001. Only 3% acknowledged themselves as Muslims, which increased to 4.8 in 2011. Very important, non-religious people declared 15% in 2001, 25% in 2011. And because people could actually choose their own religion, you can find that 177,000 people actually identified as Jedi, which is something connected to Star Wars. So all these trends are very interesting, and I could imagine that in the latest census, which was 2021, we would have an increase in numbers in all of these factions. So what I wanted to understand within this context, so we have lots of churches that are currently empty. They don't have a purpose in our current society in England, and they need a lot of funds for conservation. In parallel, we have lots of people understanding these churches as an important landmark in the city. Everybody still understands these churches as landmarks when they see them, because they are different within the landscape, either the cityscape or the rural landscape. But if we were to go to Italy or to Spain on holidays or to France, we would probably visit churches as part of our tourist heritage trail. So there is this connection between people recognizing these landmarks as heritage, as something they should contribute to conserve and to protect for the future. And it seems to me that this barrier is a cultural barrier, being that if I am not part of that particular religion, I don't see how I can participate in the conservation of it. So what we wanted to generate with this public engagement, part of our main question was, can we transform these churches into community assets? What do people consider nowadays as sacred? What makes people feel safe and peaceful and relaxed in these times when we all are having all our mobile phones and we really don't have a lot of time just to be quiet and reflective. So what we realize is that on the one hand, most people have a cultural understanding of sacredness. So most people will identify religious places as sacred places, whether they participate in that religion or not. But there is a knowledge that we have to be respectful towards others' beliefs. But then there is the personal understanding of what is sacred, meaning that most people in our questionnaire realize that for them, what is sacred is, home, natural spaces, places where you can actually reflect and contribute to that, peace of mind. If you were in Nottingham, you would have probably visited Pitcher and Piano, which is a former church, the former Unitarian chapel from 1876, which has been transformed into a bar. I am not a religious person, but I have a Catholic background. And I have to say that when I went there for the first time, I found it a bit shocking to go and drink and have a drink and lunch in a church, because culturally that was a bit strange for me. So our interrogation was again towards the built environment. Is it possible to change our perception of buildings that are religious? Is that element still remaining in the buildings when they are deconsecrated, or can any place be sacred without being consecrated? So we use this questionnaire to talk to 300 plus people. And you have to imagine that this was folded, so you could only see one bit at a time. So the first element was asking people how do they define sacred spaces, which places in Nottingham were sacred to them, and then how to draw these spaces. Then we were giving them a few clues, but it was too late to change the first bits. And on the other side, we gave them a map of Nottingham, and we requested them to identify places that they consider sacred. And the most popular one was actually the Arboretum, which is a place very close to our university. And it's a big park in the middle of the city center, which people tended to go for walks, and they found that was sacred. But we had all sorts of definitions and all sorts of drawings of what was sacred to them, to the extent that out of our 327 participants, the most popular spaces as sacred, both as the definitions and drawings, were natural spaces, parks, green and blue landscapes. The second one was religious buildings, and the third one was the idea of home. But always, if you can see from all the descriptions that we have collected, there is this idea of a place somewhere that is peaceful, that is quiet, that helps me to understand what I'm doing in life. So we created this map of an imaginary Nottingham. It's not real, it's only the river trend that we kept. But we just wanted to show that actually through the definitions that we had, in most neighborhoods, you will always find a green space, a religious building, and your home. So sacredness is really, out there for us to use. In September 2019, we showed this map in a Heritage Open Day at the university, and we got a group of kids, school kids, and it was very interesting how they also presented and represented their sacredness through their bedrooms, their bathrobes, football, their fridge. So our intention is to keep understanding these different approaches to sacredness through public consultations, which hopefully we can start doing again soon, to keep working on this project, because we have also conducted a couple of interviews, and one of the participants, who is a Catholic, bicultural and still going as to church, and he said, when I look at that mountain, it is all quiet and peace. Even if I sit in a quiet church, I can admire the architecture, but never feel a sense of solitude, a sense of spirituality as I feel up there. So even when culturally we have certain beliefs, we still have our own personal approaches to what sacredness is. So that's what we want to do next, to create a very rich and multi-layered map to demonstrate that diversity and embrace it and share it with everyone else. And that's me. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Anna. This is great. You were right on time. I didn't have to give you an extension in terms of time. My red background came up, so this is great. Excellent. So and thank you so much for that presentation. You can stop sharing your screen at this point, and then we will request the next presenter to join in. So our next presenter today is Hu Ying Kerr. Hu Ying Kerr is at Nottingham Trent University in the UK. And the title of the presentation is Repackaging the Local, Japanese Uniqueness and International Consumption in the 1980s, Japanese Bubble Economy. Now, Hu Ying is a senior lecturer in product design at Nottingham Trent University, completing her PhD in history of design at the RCA and the V&A Museum in 2017. Hu Ying's work explores consumer cultures of the 1980s Japanese bubble economy. She has presented her research at numerous conferences, including the Tate Research Center, Asia and the CAA 2018 at the latter. Hu Ying also chaired a Design History Society panel on the theme of peripheral narratives with a follow-up international networking event at NTU. Hu Ying is currently working on a chapter for the forthcoming publication, Modern Living in Asia, 1945 to 1990, which is going to be published by Bloomsbury Academic. So Hu Ying, I welcome you to the floor for your presentation. Thank you.
Right. Thank you very much, Manu. Let me just share my screen, if that's okay. Bear with me, and I'll start my presentation. Oh, goodness, sorry. Apologies. That's not the one I wanted to share, this one. Okay, so hello, everyone. Thank you very much for coming to my talk, and also to the conference organizers for kindly inviting me, and of course, Manu for very kindly being the chair today. My name, as you know, is Dr. Hu Ying Kerr. Please call me Ying. And this is my paper, as Manu has already very kindly introduced, Repackaging the Local, Japanese Uniqueness and International Consumption in the 1980s Japanese Bubble Economy. So this paper explores how Japan's 80s were a pivotal time of economic, social, and cultural change during a period of internationalization. Taking inspiration from Marcus's multi-site ethnography, this research draws on a variety of cultural objects as melting pots for tradition, authenticity, and identity. So just a bit of background. By the 1980s, Japan's account surplus had propelled it to being the second largest economy in the world, challenging the dominance of 20th century Western hegemony. Following international pressure, Japan signed the 1985 Plaza Accord, upwardly revaluing the yen against the dollar and opening up its domestic markets. This led to rapid asset hyperinflation called the bubble economy. More than a financial and property bubble, this was a time of consumer leisure and reassessment of Japanese identity and prestige. A significant policy was that of kokusaika, which was of meaning internationalization, a political invention to liberalize the Japanese market, introduce global goods and services to an enriched yen, and thus reduce trade tensions. Alongside was the opposite trend of Nihonjiron, or Japanese exceptionalism. This 1970s cultural nationalism gained ground alongside kokusaika, the internationalization, manifesting in museums, foundations, and expos, with 90 new facilities built in 1988 alone. Riding the boom in leisure and tourism was renewed vigor in promoting a more entertaining Japanese cultural heritage domestically, notably in the development of historical theme parks and domestic tourism to rural locations and sites of heritage interest. So while the popularity of domestic tourism can be traced to phenomena such as the 1970s Japan Rail Countryside Campaign, the 1980s are primarily associated with international travel rather than domestic. Yet despite internationalizing policies, local attractions were aimed mainly at domestic Japanese tourists. Young working women in particular were an ideal audience due to their high levels of disposable income and time. So in this JR advertisement, young Japanese women feature center stage, divided into tourists and locals. Surrounded by the famous Amar female pearl divers, two tourists are offered seafood as they enjoy themselves by the Japanese sea. Urging the reader, let's round your eyes in Ise and loosen your cheeks in Shima. This is aimed at young women looking for what Prentice terms experiential tourism, offering the romanticism and authentic experience of rural traditional Japan, materialized in seafood harvested directly from the sea. More subtly is the subtext of emancipation and search for authentic self, following 1970s strategies advertising travel to young women, as well as the 1980s zeitgeist, Ona no Jidai, meaning women's era, that the period was seen as. And this can be seen in the female-centered theme of this advert, with the warm connection between the modern urban women and traditional female divers enjoying each other's company, sharing food in a community of working women. While this does not depict the reality of Amar diving, nor of the office working ladies, it calls on imaginative processes necessary in systems of tourism production, applied to imagining the Japanese traditional and rural. So these themes of romanticism, experience tourism, and quest for authentic emancipated self located in the rural informed the Japanese animation Only Yesterday. Based on a 1982 manga, this bubble era anime was a surprise hit, becoming the highest grossing Japanese film in the country at the time. Featuring a 27-year-old office lady, Takeyo Okajima, she travels to the countryside to harvest self-love the traditional way, escaping city life. During the trip, she reminisces about her childhood, interrogating the direction of her life. The romance of the countryside, traditional working, and living one's authentic life are themes that run throughout the film, culminating in a call to return to more authentic living. And this was actually at odds with the surface of the 1980s bubble economy and its drive to work, consume, and internationalize. However, while the romanticism of the rural and traditional was easily produced in media, adjustment was required for tangible consumption. So in Hanako magazine, a popular lifestyle magazine for young women at the time, special features on the ancient capital of Kyoto and hot spring towns organized the historic and traditional into easily consumable chunks, where to stay, eat, shop, and enjoy traditional entertainment and craft. In the Kyoto issue, as you can see here, images feature charmingly traditional tatami rooms in Japanese ryokan inns and Japanese cuisine served on black lacquerware. Yet chopped up and spliced together with addresses and telephone numbers and descriptions, Kyoto becomes less of an experience and more a buffet of consumer choice. Likewise, in the hot springs onsen issue, the traditional Japanese activity has modernized, competing with modern resorts and themed facilities to create a market of contemporized enjoyment. Cultural sites become part of a globalized practice of leisure tourism, combining traditional Japanese pastimes and culture with modern trends such as health tourism, the romantic gaze, and access to heritage and tradition as leisure. But rather than binaries of traditional and modern, this practice of blending heritage with contemporary characterizes the commercial approach to tradition. In a series of early 1980s commercials by cosmetics brand Shiseido, traditional Japanese tropes of festival or matsuri, kabuki theater, and Japanese doll are used to connect with their audience on the transition to womanhood. Featuring kimono-wearing women and children, sagimai egret temple dancers, and calligraphy master and pupil, the commercials use traditional figures intercut with powerful modern direction, dramatic lighting, and dynamic shamisen, vocal, and synthesizer music to create pieces that are surreal, mysterious, sumptuous, and elegant, marrying old with the new. Although Shiseido has a reputation for combining Japanese culture with the West, these commercials do more than just appropriate culture for sale. Treading a fine line between innocence and sensuality, they show Japanese heritage incorporated into a modern context, updating whilst bestowing spiritual and cultural authenticity to everyday products. I did actually have some videos I wanted to embed into the presentation to show everyone. However, due to time constraints, I'm not doing it right now, but if there's time at the end, I would love to be able to show you some of these videos on YouTube because they're just amazing. So please do ask if you wish to look at them and if we have time. Utilizing a similar strategy is an advert by Saito Mokoto for the Hasegawa Corporation, a manufacturer of Butsudan domestic Buddhist altars and other religious products. Comprising of two posters featuring a human femur and pelvis, they reference Japanese calligraphic aesthetic traditions through the copy and composition of the subtle off-center placement of the bones and modern pop art through their electric blue and near flat shading. With no explanation of the product or company, it utilizes an abstracted visual language popular in 1980s Tokyo advertising, while referencing Zen aesthetics through its empty background and empty space composition. Here, design blends Japanese traditional culture with the modern commercial world, marrying spirit, culture, and commerce in an elegant and sophisticated solution that led to it being collected by New York's MoMA. While appearing disparate in form and content, these examples demonstrate a blending and incorporating of traditional Japanese forms within a modern context, increasing levels of sophistication going beyond the commercial. Japanese tradition and heritage remain the locale of authentic culture and spirituality, providing an essential link between Japan's ancient past and modern life. At a time when Japan was coming out of its mid-century growth mindset, they indicate a reconciliation of its present with national culture, anchoring it even while preparing to scale new heights internationally. However, not all commercial uses of heritage were as elegantly integrated. Although identified with spiritual and cultural authenticity, traditional aesthetics were also used in service of health and the body, notably in medicines and new foods. Heritage could thus be used to soften and neutralize the new, providing a cynical strategy of creating a ready-made lineage. In some cases, they went too far. So here we see a traditionally dressed Japanese woman practicing the martial art of kendo, her poise and aura heightened by the forest waterfall backdrop. Yet on closer examination, the products advertised are kampo laxatives, which, while not inherently wrong in itself, falls into farce in attempting to elevate the product through nature and tradition. The affiliation with bowel movements cheapens the solemnity of the scene, turning it unintentionally comic. This watering down of heritage can also be seen in another 1980s enterprise, the Heritage Theme Park. This refers to Hendry's definition describing a leisure park organized around a theme, usually cultural or historic. During the 1980s, many theme parks opened, taking advantage of the leisure boom. A prime example is Edo Wonderland Nikko Edomura, or Edo Village. Opened in 1986, it centers around the historical feudal Edo period of the 1600s to mid-1800s, known for economic stability and flourishing of arts and culture. It was also a time of self-isolation before Japan's opening up and Western modernization of the Meiji period. So it's quite of an idealized time of isolation and Japanese tradition without the Western kind of culture coming in. While Nikko Edomura is designed around the idea of an authentic Edo village, complete with actors in historical dress, it also features much more modern demands, such as souvenir shops, waxwork museums, a haunted temple, a house of mirrors, a ninja labyrinth, and a ninja grand theatre, the latter holding multiple shows daily. And here's some examples of other activities you can partake in from their website. While seemingly tacky and inauthentic, Edo Village's popularity has meant that it still exists today, surviving the recessionary lost decades following the bubble, and attracting tourists and a common setting for film and television. As a genre, it is linked to the flourishing industry of local cultural tourism of the 1980s. Government directives encouraging consumer leisure, combined with new avenues for international funding and asset and property booms, led to the development of tourist attractions on a national scale. From hot spring towns and heritage villages to national and international festivals, museums, and expos, these provided the vehicle for the redevelopment and reinvigoration of towns and villages, the speculation of surplus funds generated from the bubble as investments, and opportunities for pork barrel local politics that plagued property development and that were uncovered during the bursting in the 1990s. However, although commercial, theme parks like Edo Village also have a useful cultural function of providing the means by which essential Japaneseness may be participated. For Japan, which experienced rapid modernization from the 19th century onwards and traumas in the 20th century, the distant past can appear disconnected from modern Japanese life. Instead, Japanese heritage becomes an escape from the everyday, a rejection of the pressures of modern living in favor of performing cultural Japaneseness through ossified forms. Conversely, participating in and experiencing heritage can also be a way in which modernity is performed, juxtaposed against a past that bears little resemblance to the present. Compared to the authenticity of ancient living cities such as Kyoto, the very artificiality of Edo Village is an asset, neutralizing the past, rendering it more easily as leisure entertainment. Its commercial slant helps to reduce its otherness, creating a low-risk cultural environment where visitors are free from judgment to relax, performing their modernity as more real than the simulated past constructed around them. Like Baudrillard's understanding of Disneyland's true simulated purpose, Edo Village's tackiness is the draw, a necessary facilitator of the acceptance and performance of modern Japanese existence. However, while Japanese heritage theme parks might appear culturally appropriate in Japan, the sudden boom in foreign theme parks are more jarring. Known as gaikokumura, or foreign villages, they feature no rides or amusements, but attractions based around the theme of a foreign country. Ranging from German, Dutch, Swiss, Spanish, to Canadian, Russian, and general Oriental and Middle Eastern themes, these foreign villages are characterized by an exhaustive attention to detail, from replicas of architecture and interiors to providing experiences of authentic food and music, populated by a revolving cast of inhabitants. Examples of the latter include Spanish flamenco dancers in Chima, Spain village, and Dutch exchange students from Leiden University in the Dutch theme park Huitenbosch in Nagasaki. They get to stay there for a whole year, as long as they live on site. While inhabitants look the part, in reality, they may be drawn from a more diverse geography, so long as they appear authentic enough to Japanese visitors. Hendry in 2000, for example, recounts artists from Romania, Czechoslovakia, and Hungary used to populate the Grimm Dorf village based on the Brothers Grimm, set within the German foreign village of Glückskönigreich in Obihiro, that you can see here. Benefiting from the conditions of the bubble that included encouragement to develop cultural, educational, and economic regional stimulus through the resort law, policies of Kokusaika internationalization, and directives to increase leisure from the 1986 Meikawa report, these gaikokumura may appear as bubble phenomena, with many theme parks folding in the 1990s. Yet, many remain open to date, with significant numbers of domestic visitors averaging 1 to 2 million in some of the top parks annually. Theme parks and foreign villages appear to have survived the bubble to become culturally significant in their own right, providing a specific service of leisure and experience of the foreign, conveniently located, but also performing essential Japaneseness in face of the other. Similar to how Tokyo Disneyland had an insistence on keeping Frontierland, they renamed it Westernland, rather than agreeing to a pastiche of Japan, which is normal in the Disney franchise. This allowed Japanese visitors to experience being Japanese in a domesticated vision of America. So imagining various world cultures enclosed within a Japanese framework enables domestic visitors to play at visiting different cultures, whilst also reinforcing the Japanese identity safely without risk of encountering the other in reality. Furthermore, while foreign villages show exhaustive attention to detail and faithful reproduction of buildings, costumes, food, arts, crafts, and inhabitants, implicit within this is an understanding that authenticity is in fact unimportant. Although perfected form may be achieved, unrealness nevertheless needs to be present for authentic identity, Japanese identity, to be confirmed, aided by the twinning of tangible cultural and historical forms with the fictional and fantastical. In addition to the Brothers Grimm theme at Gluck's Coningre, here, as you can see here, and Shima Spain, also known as Parque España, it takes inspiration from the stories of Don Quixote. The Canadian world combines it with the literary world of Anne of Green Gables, whose house you can actually go visit, despite the fact that she's completely fictional. While a quaint and popular way of connecting with audiences, combining locations with literary fiction further places a foreign country within the world of the imaginary, encouraging Japanese audiences to see and play with the rest of the world as fantasy made tangible. However, while theorists like Baudrillard saw Disneyland as a distraction from the fundamental unreality of postmodern America, the Japanese experience of foreign villages reaffirms the primacy of Japanese identity. In this, they are not the passive audience of Baz's Tokyo Disneyland that he wrote about, subject to a controlled experience, but active participants in playful contact with other cultures, controlling the experience as much as reveling in the co-creation of what it means to be Japanese. So to conclude, the bubble economy's impact on Japanese tradition and heritage, with greater global prominence and calls to internationalize through kokusai policies, there was a converse rise in unofficial nationalist Nihonjiron phenomena. This can be seen in the reaffirming of Japanese traditional culture through calls to authentic living and re-engagement with Japanese heritage in tourism, media, and development of cultural institutions. Secondly, with calls to improve living standards through increased leisure, an explosion in asset values, and access to international financing, the bubble led to a boom in developing cultural assets as a way to stimulate local regions through tourism and leisure. Thus, market liberalization and internationalist policies led to a doubling down on domestic-centered culture rather than internationalizing Japan. However, this catering to domestic audiences made possible a translation of tradition, enabling its practical functioning in a modern consumer society. This ranged from successful blending of the traditional with contemporary to create advertising that was respectful, grounded, and relevant, to the cynical or bungled, commodifying heritage in the process of capitalization. Nevertheless, in updating and making accessible, Japanese traditional culture also inadvertently transformed into answering a different contemporary need of reaffirming essential Japaneseness, necessary when Japan was becoming more international and traditional attributes of modesty, quietness, and simplicity were under transformation in the brash excesses of bubble culture. In the cultural villages of Nikko Edamura and theme parks of foreign Daikokumura, it was possible to reconfirm one's contemporary Japaneseness, whether through encounter with the historic past or with a neutralized foreign, relieving any disquiet about modern living as explored in the anime only yesterday. In this, the essential unreality of the other was key, whether through time or fiction, and thrown into sharp relief by the material exactitude of physical surroundings. Yet while escaping the cultural uneasiness of the bubble, the surreal and excessive nature of these theme parks perfectly encapsulated the unreal nature of the bubble economy itself, only to reveal itself as a fever dream based on unstable assets in the bursting of the 1990s. Nevertheless, despite the issues of the following lost decades, the bubble economy enabled Japan to invest in its own culture, providing financial resources and political will to integrate to a changing contemporary and increasingly globalized society, creating a valuable cultural anchor point as it moved forward into the uncertain waters of the 1990s. And that's the end of my presentation. Thank you very much for listening, everyone.
Wonderful, Hu Ying. That was wonderful, and a really good follow up on the first presentation that we had. So and you were right on time. So I think we just cannot complain about anything at all. So at this particular point, let's move on to our third presenter. Our third presenter today is Flavia Brito do Nascimento from the University of Sao Paulo in Brazil. And she's presenting a paper titled Favelas and Heritage Making and Narratives. Now, Flavia is a historian, architect, and professor at the Faculty of Architecture and Urbanism at the University of Sao Paulo. She has authored and co-authored several books, the most recent being titled as Domesticity, Gender, and Material Culture. This came out in 2017. She was also a postdoctoral fellow at the Sao Paulo Research Foundation at the Université de Paris, Pantheon Sorbonne in 2019, 2020. So at this point, Flavia, the floor is all yours. You have shared screen and you can start now. Thank you.
Yes. Hello, everyone. Good morning from Brazil, from São Paulo. Thank you for the organizing of this excellent event, and for Manu for sharing this session. The last time in Coimbra we were together in the session, so it's good to see you again, and thank you for this. So this presentation that I put together today is part of a long-term research about housing, heritage, and domesticity, focusing on the challenges of public housing and modernity in Brazil. But I also looked upon public housing preservation challenges in France over the last 2 years during my postdoctoral fellowship, but in comparison to the Brazilian cases. But for these presentations, I will focus on an ongoing part of this research where I try to understand the role of preservation in the so-called informal settlements. It's a very complicated term, but it's used. That it's known also as favelas in Portuguese. This became an international name also. I try to understand how the favelas represent the huge inequalities in the field of heritage and how they are being contested by the inhabitants as a right to the city and a right to memory. So for this, I divide the presentation into 3 parts: an overview of heritage history in Brazil and its authorized heritage discourse, how our authorized heritage discourse is built upon. And secondly, I moved into the urban heritage and inequalities in Brazil and how social housing can be part of this, and it is not part of this heritage policies. And finally, I ask if the favelas are heritage frontiers in the country, since there are a lot of favela museums experiences going on right now in the country. So the authorized heritage discourse in Brazil was put together in the 1930s when the National Heritage Institute was organized. It wasn't the first created in the country, but it was the most important and long-lasting until today. It is the main responsible for heritage selection in the country. And since Brazil is a federative country, since the 1980s, federal and local governments share the responsibility of protecting heritage, as our constitution puts in. But Federal Institute is the more prestigious and significant because it has more value in terms of the recognitions of cultural access, or because it has more resources to provide public policies, and finally because it is legitimized as a voice to promote these identity making processes in Brazil. The National Heritage Institute was created during the Vargas regime, certainly one of the most complex and challenging periods of Brazilian political life. To say this today, it's kind of complicated because we are living in a very complicated political times in Brazil. But in the Vargas era, the modern Brazil was put together. It was a totalitarian state ruled by Vargas, a very charismatic and political persona, and also very ambitious. Heritage Institution was then created within the working class rights political frame, and the laws lasted over 80 years, and still at this moment we are seeing all this political frame for heritage preservation in Brazil being dismantled by the actual government. So heritage and nation, as in all the Western history of heritage making processes, they are interconnected in very complex relations. As in other countries, this process is connected to the idea of nation building and intellectuals, but in the Brazilian case, by the modernists. So the very same architect that designed, created, and acted politically to build Brasilia Lucio Costa, known as Costa, was in charge of the heritage listing. He was the main architect of heritage policies in Brazil. So then he put together a team of modernist architects that built this palace. For instance, this is the known on the left side up, one of the first modernist buildings in the historiography of Brazil, the Capanema Palace in Rio de Janeiro. And they built this building. There was Le Corbusier came to Brazil and helped to design. And there's a whole inauguration of modernism in Brazil, 1936, when this building was put together. They also were selecting architecture from the colonial period that was understood as capable of building our nation. So the colonial period is the 16th until the 18th centuries. So Ouro Preto, black gold in English, if we translate, is representative of this homogeneous cities, symbol of the idea of heritage in Brazil. So this heritage selection was structured into architectural knowledge. So these cities such as Ouro Preto, colonial cities, all white, rebuilt into all white, with a lot of churches. To speak with Ana Souto's presentation, it's basically made with churches. They were looked upon into the ideas of beauty, authenticity, and harmony. So very, very few historic centers were considered as such as, I'm sorry, I think I'm missing a map, but very few historic centers are considered as such historic centers in Brazil, because the modernist architects have been very, very strict into their selections. And the choices that were made during the Vargas regime lasted until almost very, very recently in Brazil, guided into these architectural lenses. So during the 2000s, when the Working Party, the Partido dos Trabalhadores, the PT, ruled the country, there were a vast expansion of heritage discourses, with lots of contestations of what was already established as heritage, or as heritage identity. Brazil was pioneering the intangible preservation law, approved in the year 2000, before UNESCO's 2003 Intangible Heritage Convention. Since then, immaterial heritage gained visibility and was responsible for a significant democratization of the field. The heritage lists were no more focused in architecture and became much more diverse and representative of Brazilian cultures, looking upon minorities, notably the Afro-Brazilians. Nonetheless, what I argue is the authorized heritage discourse is still structured in Brazil into architecture. So if we look upon the historic cities that were protected in the recent years, in this time of expansion, of protection, this time of a big economical expansion in Brazil, and also expansion of the heritage discourses, the cities that were selected are still very much representative of this colonial frame. They are very, very much representative of this discourse that was put together into the 1930s. So I think that there are, me and other authors are arguing that there is a lot of inequalities in national heritage in Brazil that pass by selective practices that very rarely consider the appropriations and belongings by the inhabitants, to the unequal distribution of these cultural heritages within the national territory. So I choose one of these inequalities, that is social housing, because it can be very, very eloquent of these inequalities. So if you look upon the statistics of what is considered heritage in by national heritage. So we have this number is changed, but around 1,300 assets, but these include cities. So one is probably a city. There's a lot of cities within this frame, within these numbers, and only 13 can be are from social housing. So very, very few examples that are considered in the national level, based mostly on the aesthetic and architectural criteria. So I'm not saying that these social housings that are within the architectural history of architectural frames, such as this one, we have wonderful and very interesting examples of modernist housing blocks. Myself, I've published in the Traditional Settlements Dwelling Review the past year an article about one of these, the preservation of one of these. There are some of them that are protected. There's a lot to do, but what I'm arguing here is that maybe this isn't enough, because favelas are part of Brazilian urban landscapes. If we look at the statistics, around 40% of Brazilian populations inhabit in these settlements. They are part of Brazilian urban history also. It's mostly recognized as part of a domesticity and ways of living in Brazilian culture, albeit in a very stigmatized form. They go back 100 years, more than that. Generations have lived and still will live in these places. And as we can see in this map in red, this is the map of the city of Rio. In red are all the favelas in the territory. So they represent a lot in the urban fabric of Rio, but also in São Paulo and in other places. So how to understand them as part of our urban history and our urban tradition? To go beyond the understanding of the removal, of the renovation, and understand belonging and memories, is the effort of a lot of people, mostly the inhabitants, the people that live in these places, that are at this point trying to say that memory is part of their communities. They are putting together since the 1980s, based on the concept of social museology, a lot of museums in which the memory and heritage arised in the past. So if we look at Rio, I put the map before. If we look at Rio, what is considered cultural assets, around about 1,000, and then only 27 are from social housing. And so the favela museums have arisen as a movement in the 80s. This was a very, very important decade of redemocratization, and also a very important decade for heritage worldwide, which the Japanese case shows how this arose in Japan in the 80s in a certain way. And in Brazil, the 80s, there was a boom of heritage, very, very important. And the public interest in actions possible during the year 2000s really gave the opportunity for the rising of these favela museums. They are more than these 5 that I put here. By now, they are around 10 favela museums. They are very different amongst each others, as are the favelas. The favelas are very different between each other. They are rooted in social forms of organization and in the urban landscape. The first one, I will show a couple. The first one is the Morro da Providência. It's probably it's known by historiography as the first favela that gave the name favela because of a plant that was in this area, and it's right next to the river shore, right next to the port where the Olympic Games had taken place, a part of the Olympic Games in Rio. So it is building its identity in this idea of history. There is a church that you can see in the right. I don't know if I can show you here. So it's a very old church, and this is very symbolic of Brazilian heritage. So they are using kind of a traditional way of understanding heritage and putting together within this urban occupation. So the museum is not a building in itself, it's an open air museum where the visitor can go through the public spaces and understand the urban occupation. So this is a very, very important favela, also because it is within the UNESCO buffer zone of the Rio cultural landscape, as well as another favela. There are two within the UNESCO urban landscape. So here are some images of this, the church, the small chapel, and the interventions that inhabitants do in the places and to do this open air museum. So the second one is the Maré Museum, that is place of a huge complex of communities. It's a complex of favelas. It is also rooted into history, and it was formed during the urban expansion process of Rio to the northern zone, the industrial zone. And it's characterized by the occupation of this swampy area with stilt houses that no longer exist. But the museum that was created in 2006 by the young inhabitants in order to change the bad representations of this place, because it has a lot of violence. It's a very, very, it used to be a very violent and with a lot of interventions from the state, and it has its own headquarters. It has its own headquarters museum, and there's an exhibition of the daily life. So after these two, other favelas are creating their own museology options, as the Cantagalo in the middle of the richer area of the city, Copacabana and Ipanema. The Favela Museum, that is a graffiti museum operating as an open-air and territorial museum as an art gallery. So coming to an end, I will show the last one, that's the Removals Favela, Museu das Remoções. This favela was removed. It was right next to the Olympics also, and it was removed. You can see here is the favela, and here is the Olympic complex, and there was a lot of contestation, and the inhabitants, by the end, they got out of the place, and they created this ruin museum, so you can visit the ruins. The people were put out, and so here you can see memory isn't removed. It says there. So really, to wrap up my presentation, this is my last slide. I will just consider the last part. As long as heritage selective practice remain focused on objects and not on social subjects or cultural references, there will be an insistence on selecting certain forms and certain typologies more than others, certain buildings more than others, and as if the object or the typological series were an end in itself. Even though the buildings can really be important, the hierarchy built between them by the heritage making process produced by those that are enabled to select it will continue to produce inequalities rather than inclusion. The favela museums are capable of showing how much more it is to be considered in heritage in Brazil, and how heritage can play a role in mitigating huge inequalities, vastly studying in the urban realm, but muted in heritage policies. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Flavia. You can stop sharing your slides. That's wonderful. So I think this is a very, very good, sort of conclusion to the two other papers. So Thank you so much, Anna, Hu Ying, and Flavia for your papers. And now I think we can go into the question answer session. At the beginning, I had requested everyone to either write in their questions in the chat box in case they were not staying till the end. But I think we've had a few people who've stayed through the three papers, so I'm glad that they are around. And then I think I have a comment here. Okay, so uh, is there a question from the audience? Are there any questions from the audience? I can see some of the audience here. Um, so yeah. Okay, so I actually think I'll get into the questions. I thought these were three really wonderful presentations, and for me, probably the most interesting point that comes across really uh, is the way in which the three of you, even though your cases are somewhat different one from the other, uh, you actually, in some ways, talk about the changing meaning of the term heritage. How is heritage defined in each case? And so, essentially, from what I've seen in the three presentations from Anna to Hu Ying to Flavia, is that it seemed the terminology of the heritage or the implications of heritage, they seem to move from the artifactual quality of heritage to something that's connected more to the representation of nation state or people. And I think that that's quite interesting for me. What I think is also interesting is the way in which the actors and the agency of heritage is is different in each case, of course, but it's not what we would normally associate that with. Usually, when we think about heritage, at least in the literature, in the ICOMOS literature, we actually look at it from the outside. We see it vis-a-vis a larger set of guidelines, a larger set of parameters that we measure that against. But the three papers that were presented today, they actually look at heritage from bottom up. They give new meanings to the way in which actors and agencies actually begin to work. What is also for me quite interesting is the way in which um, this way of defining or redefining heritage also has its own implications. It has its afterlives, if one could say, and it has its afterlives in the way in which we look at the past. And I think that happens in all of you. In Anna's case, I think this manner in which the church and the people and their social choreographies combine together also brings up to question, what is, who is a true believer, the meaning of religion, and so on and so forth. In the case of Hu Ying, I think the whole idea of these so-called social choreographies, which at first glance would be sort of cheap or tourism oriented, are also choreographies that are, I think, deeply connected to the identity of who you are as Japanese, to the creation and the recreation of self. So, and I think in the third presentation, the idea of the favela as being only 100-year old, and that 100-year is a very easy way to point a finger at the favela and say it's only 100 years old. But that 100-year-old tradition is coming from a much longer tradition that the people are really about. So it actually allows us to reassess what the past is about. And I think the biggest question for me in the three presentation was, if at all we do consider that this panel was about indigenous and cultural landscapes, the so-called Hull approach or the historic urban landscapes approach writ large and sort of poked holes into, then how would this heritage need to be preserved? How can it be preserved? In some ways, it is a contentious heritage. All three cases were contentious. In Anna's case, the idea that churches should belong to anyone simply because we should think of them as community assets, I think is contentious because someone might say, well, it's a church. And I'm sort of, if I go to the other side of the world, Similar debates are beginning to happen in India, for instance, where the Muslim places of worship, the mosques, are now seen as symbols that are connected to the contested ethnicities of the people who reside in certain parts of the city. And in Hu Ying's case, I think the idea of how would you preserve this kind of social practice of actually going to a resort, of actually participating in the advertisements, in the products that are sold, or you vicariously participate in the feelings that are exhibited by the people who actually sell them, as it were. I think that's interesting for me. And in the last case, the idea of how would a favela be preserved? Can it really be preserved? Or is it a continuous heritage practice, as it were? I think it's quite interesting for me. So, in some ways, I've attempted to actually set the ball rolling in terms of any other questions that might emerge. And I can see a few people having switched on their cameras, which is great. I mean, we have a few people and we could all switch on our cameras and have a great time talking to each other. But, it's totally up to you. So I'll stop here. And everyone can react, or some of us can react. So totally open floor. Hi, Nazar.
You're muted.
Mute myself. I
Yes.
said I attended much of the session and I very much enjoyed it. Very, very good papers. And I have a couple of questions or comments, if you guys would allow me. One of which maybe I'll start actually with Flavia, since that is work that I'm more familiar with. And I really found it very interesting. But, in the end, I didn't really get a conclusion from you, Flavia, because I think, particularly in the context of the current Brazil, with Bolsonaro being in charge, and I think Brazilian identity itself is under attack. So how can one have a discourse about heritage at a time when the identity of what Brazil is itself? Again, this is a situation that I'm sure you're aware is also happening in the United States, where the specter of Trump's return is still there very strongly. So I just wanted a reaction from you on that. And then I have another question for Anna.
So should I start myself?
Yes, please.
Okay,
I mean, it's a question addressed to you.
Yes, I think this is. Thank you, Nizar, for your question, and it's very complicated, because we were in almost there, almost democratizing heritage, and almost saying the favelas are heritage. Favelas are part of our Black history. They are part of our of what we are as a nation, and we should consider these places. And now it seems very much unlikely. It is. So in the very beginning, I was in the very beginning of the Bolsonaro government, I was in a sense very intimately very curious to figure out what would they select as heritage, what would be a nation building for them. And as it seems by now, after 2 years, it is our imperial past.
Yes.
That it's arising. So the museum and all the imperial museum, and this is arising. So this was the moment in history that we were in the second year of slavery, where all other countries have already stopped slavery, and Brazil was the last country. So it represents something that it isn't the democratization of heritage. So it seems very much unlikely that at this point we can recognize. I am counselor of heritage in São Paulo, and what we are witnessing is a lot. It's huge how the market is pushing the heritage areas. They are pushing to turn down the heritage areas that are designated. They are building high-rise buildings. They are really pressing, and the heritage council is completely dominated. So it seems very by the market, by the real estate market. So it seems very unrealistic at this point. but still, I think my role here is to still understand and still push this idea that if we have to understand heritage as a form of right, of urban right, and the right of memory, it's important. So I don't have really a conclusion by now, but
Yes.
this is
No,
my
I,
thoughts on heritage.
I fully
And this
understand.
right now.
Manu, if you let me, can I also ask a question of Anna?
Oh, sure, please,
Yes,
absolutely.
and I loved your paper, Anna, and I loved the you know, some of the examples, particularly the example of the church, and I think you posed an interesting question that I wanted you to elaborate on more. The notion of a church that actually becomes something else over time because it has been used, you know, for something else altogether, which is very common actually in California. So, you know, one of my colleagues, for example, bought a church and lives in a church, but it's a house. And you showed examples of that altogether. And one of the things that I wanted to know is to what extent, particularly in the engagement you've had with people, because you seem to have done this work, to what extent do people actually always remember that it is a church to the extent that they cannot remove this from their mind? I say that because in the examples I know of in California, the term sacred has completely disappeared from public discourse. And it certainly has disappeared in the minds of the individuals and their visitors who occupy these houses. So what do you think?
Thank you very much for your comments and questions. I think one of the main elements, and connected to other comments made earlier, is that the only way for many churches to stay as churches is to become community assets and be a lot more flexible about how they invite and embrace other communities. But of course, there have been so many churches made into something else. For example, in the UK, there is a charity that is trying to maintain chapels in the countryside. And rather than changing the interior, what they are doing is to offer some sort of experience as champling. So you have camping, you have glamping, and you have chapling. So you go to a chapel and you just,
okay.
you know, which is quite interesting. It is as expensive as going to a hotel. So I haven't experienced it because I don't see the point. But there are all these ways of trying to find ways of reusing them. There are examples of churches becoming, as you mentioned, housing, also gyms, skateboarding spaces. So because of their architectural features, characteristics, they are very useful for many different, different uses. What many of my students have done as part of their dissertations in architecture is to try to analyze this idea of what you were just saying, are they still sacred spaces, or are we just used to that, to those architectural features that connect us to our cultural understanding of what a religious building is? So, and I really understand what you're saying about this. Your friends and colleagues may not consider them as sacred anymore. However, you can recognize those architectural features that somehow one day made them sacred. The light, the scale, the materials, and so on. And I think in contemporary religious architecture, across all the different religions, you can find those architectural features in mosques, in synagogues, in Christian churches, this idea of playing with the light, making these spaces. But Julio Bermudez and others have talked about the architecture of transcendence, so space that makes you feel, something else. But again, and connecting with Flavia's presentation, which I really loved, this idea of it's not only just the beauty of a building that should be conserved and preserved, is how we use them, and maybe their value goes beyond that, and is how we use them. And maybe if we don't use them, maybe we should get rid of them, and again maybe make them into other users or other buildings. And yeah, again, another controversial topic. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, so Nizar, and I know I'm supposed to ask questions to the presenters, but just because I think that there's an interesting thing out here.
Yes.
When you mention this thing about people in California, the whole idea of the sacred literally disappearing, and people picking up churches and residing in them and making them into homes. What happens the other way around when homes are taken and made into churches or mosques or other places of worship? Does the holiness disappear or does it still stay?
I think that that's a brilliant question. I don't know. I don't think that that phenomena has been studied from the perspective that Anna, for example, was looking at, which is one that is sort of more focused, if you will, on the sacredness of the space itself, or the recognition that people are aware that that very specific space has a meaning beyond its physicality and beyond its use. I can definitely tell you from a popular perspective, you take a house and you make it into a mosque in many parts of the United States today, and you have tremendous opposition. The community is up in arms. The community is not willing whatsoever to, entertain that. And they use whatever it is that they can. They use building code. They use land use laws to say this cannot happen. The irony is for the preacher and for the individuals who are involved in this activity, it's the exact opposite. This is a sacred space, despite its physical appearance as something that does not in any way project any sacredness. So I think it in a sense it goes both ways. But actually, to complicate the story a bit, and I can see a few hands raised for of additional questions. So I'm not going to take much time to say that. But for me, one of the very interesting examples that just happened very recently is what happened to the Hagia Sophia. So the Hagia Sophia in Istanbul, Constantinople originally, was this great church. Then for a good 400 years, it's turned into a mosque. And then for a good 70 years, it's turned into a museum. And then suddenly it's turned into a mosque again. And if you ask people who had visited it when it was a museum, its sacredness had never disappeared. And its sacredness, its so-called sacredness, had never disappeared either for the Orthodox Christians who still believe in it as a church, or for the Muslims whose grandfathers had actually used it as a mosque. And I find it very complex in a sense. One of my teachers, the great Spiro Kostov, who used to teach at Berkeley and started an entire tradition of teaching architectural history, he was an Orthodox Greek who was of Turkish origin. And when he would always lecture about the Hagia Sophia, he would always talk about it not only as a church, but he would talk about it as the church that will one day return to be a church. And here I'm talking about the 1970s and 80s. So it's not like we're talking about someone, from earlier times. And it has to do with this nature that sacredness is definitely related to form, but it's also related to a lot of other things beyond form.
Great. I think that was a really good set of questions. Now we have two more hands up.
Raised. Yes.
So Anna, because you are one of the presenters, that's why I will give you a chance second. So maybe Noha can ask a question. Noha, please.
Hello.
Hi.
Hi. Yes. I wanted to take part in this discussion because I actually had a similar question to Nizar before he asked it, and I will raise actually a kind of a controversial question to Anna. So because she's studying the churches and I'm studying the mosques in UK, so I know how I'm getting to know how, like, for example, mosques are coming into like how buildings are becoming mosques, or how the residential units are being bought and turned into a mosque. But would it be possible because I've seen in Nottingham here, I've seen a church that is being put into sale. So, and that was extremely shocking for me. So what would happen if someone from the Muslim community buy this church and turn it into a mosque? How would that be accepted in the community, for example? Because there is a rise in buying units or building mosques here in UK, and I've seen from your presentation and from living here somehow that the use of churches is actually decreasing. So what would happen? I know this would be very controversial, but what do you imagine would happen?
Thank you, Noha. It really depends on, and I will remove my hand now because I will probably add what I wanted to say as well. So there is a lot of movement between different denominations, and I think Muslims, for example, because they are increasing in numbers in the UK, they are now overtaking spaces that were usually, more traditional for other cultures and religions. I don't know, Noha, if you are aware of the example of Sneinton. There used to be a pub in Sneinton, and as the population was changed and shifted from, white British people into Muslim people, obviously people didn't go to the pub went into ruin, they had to sell, and the Muslim community bought it, and that became a mosque. And again, in terms of this idea of, is it sacred? Can it be sacred? A pub that was used as a pub and now it becomes a religious building, but it is a phenomenon that is happening in other places. I am aware of another mosque in Derby. But equally, churches, as you say, they are for sale because there are so many denominations, and yes, there's not enough people going to churches, and it's too expensive to maintain. There are different conditions that these religions would offer and how to reuse the buildings. So, for example, the more traditional ones are the Catholics. They are very careful about how they can be reused. There is a very interesting book about different examples in the Netherlands, and they use a specific Catholic church that wanted to become, I don't remember what, but it was for another denomination, and they had to remove every single sign of Catholicism in the church, otherwise they wouldn't be allowed to reuse it. So they removed any crosses, even the windows, the stained windows, everything went, because they didn't want to make a connection between the Catholics not being there anymore and being reused by another religion. So it is controversial, but equally it is very expensive to maintain an empty building. So there is a tendency to get rid of these buildings, but try to get this sort of agreement on what the new use would be. But we can have a conversation, and I can give you some bibliography about this.
Okay, thanks. Thanks, Anna.
Hi, I guess it's my turn now. I'll just lower my hand. I just wanted to add a very minor point to this discussion on churches. And Anna's probably aware of this, but I think there are 2 churches in Nottingham that have been turned into gurdwaras for Sikh community. There's one on Mansfield Road, and I think there's one in is it Sherwood Rise or something like that? I think there's another one there. So they're already in the process of being turned into other religious community buildings, which to me seems quite a fitting use of the space, because it's designed to be used as a community building for religious practice, and so it just is now being used by the Sikh community instead. I think they've been very prominent in their signage, I think, as well, which speaks to me a certain kind of confidence in acceptance in that community. So, but I'm sure you're aware of those, you've seen those.
Yeah, though I should tell you that the Gurdwara, the Sikh temple, their usage of the space is far more flexible than many of the other religions. In fact, they're quite open to, in fact, giving their space for other purposes, even while the worship in the Gurdwara is happening. So I think that would be it's an interesting example that you brought up. I think, I don't think anyone studied that, but I feel that might be a slightly different case than, for example, a mosque occupying a church. I think that might ruffle a lot of feathers. And I think it needs some thinking on that front.
Hey Omar, I'm wondering if you can let me share my screen.
Yes, please, Mark. Thank you.
Thanks, Manu. whoever has control of that. I want to get at this church discussion is fascinating. And it's fairly sad, in part because we were going to be going to a bar in a church in Nottingham at the end of our walking tour. So I want to pull that up. I want to just share a couple of photos. This is Pitcher and Piano in Nottingham. So for those of you that have been to Nottingham, you probably know about this. But
Mark, this is the example that Anna used in the presentation.
it is, okay,
Yes,
great.
yes.
Well, we were going to go there, Anna.
Yes, I mean, that's the reason that Mark wanted to, because had we actually been in Nottingham physically, we would have actually seen your example in reality, Anna.
That's right.
Mark and I went to that space when we visited Nottingham, so.
It was amazing. And then just last week I was in Vienna and we were at St. Stephen's Cathedral. And we just wandered upon a concert, a Vivaldi concert. I'm not a musician, my wife is. And I told her I went to see Vivaldi at St. Stephen's Cathedral, and she was incredibly jealous because she loves classical music. And as we were going in, sitting in line, going into the cathedral, it was packed with folks on a Saturday evening. And I ended up talking to folks from Vienna who were there, and they said there are far more people here on a Saturday evening concert than in a normal mass. That St. Stephen's Cathedral really has become a concert hall much more than a traditional religious cathedral. So I think the transformative aspects of these buildings are amazing. And rather than get rid of them, we let them evolve to the needs of today. Who knows what this building will be in 100 years? It's a 12th century building, and it might evolve to another need, from housing to bars to whatever. And it's the ability of buildings to adapt over time that I think is really remarkable. And the successful ones do make it through functional uses. So yes, it's about the architectural quality to a degree, but in my mind, it's more about the behavior and how we use these buildings consistent with what our needs are in the current generation. I think that the whole topic has been really interesting to listen to the questions. I was out listening to some other papers earlier, so I missed the earlier part. But.
Well, let me add something, since, some of the presenters actually, probably with the exception of Flavia, that were not in the Portugal conference. But in the Portugal conference, if you recall, we actually had the conference in a church, which had long been stripped of any elements of being a church because it was made into complete white. Yet at the same time, its form was so powerful that there was no way we could escape it. And we enjoyed it immensely. I don't know if I felt any holiness or sacredness during that conference. Personally, I did not. But I think it also raises the issue in Berkeley, California, which, as you know, is a very liberal city. We have a lot of churches that function as churches and simultaneously as other things. They function as concert halls. They function as places where people have birthdays. And I'm not really talking about rooms in a church. I'm talking about the main space of the church itself with the altar, so on and so forth. So the notion that in certain parts of the world, a religious space is not just simply a religious space. It's not a sacred space. It's a sacred space that shares also regular functions all the time.
Well, functions that meet today's needs. As you know, I designed a church in Berkeley.
Yes.
And it was designed to serve many uses. One of the most controversial parts of that design, and it was right across the street from University of California, we actually interviewed the homeless folks that lived in and around downtown Berkeley and trying to figure out what did they need out of a church. If a church is anything, it should be supporting the community that's around it. And what they wanted generally was a safe place to sleep that was next to the road, not hidden behind something where they could be attacked, which happens, and that was lit. So the idea was, well, let's add to this church an arcade, a covered walkway that's deep enough for the homeless to come down from People's Park and just sleep there. And then as cars are driving by, there's a sense of safety there. It's kind of eyes on the homeless that worked out. And so the controversy was many members of that church were dead set against this arcade and providing a place for homeless people to sleep. And they were very concerned that the homeless people would do damage to the building and graffiti the building and all of this stuff. And my point as the architect was, well, if you're not here to serve the very community you're embedded in, then what is your own purpose? To serve each other? That's not that helpful. So in the end, the arcade got built, and during construction, there were 3 churches under construction or renovation during Berkeley at the time. 2 of them were completely destroyed by arson during construction. And this one that I was working on was not. And I was up at People's Park one afternoon and I said, hey, you guys have heard about these arson fires. How come this church that we're working on has not been burned? And the homeless guys said, hey, look, we're watching out for that church. You're watching out for us. And I thought that was amazing. That churches really need, to reach out to their community. They're going to change over time. This church and the uses will change over time. But I think it's, incumbent upon architects to reach beyond just the form and think about the use and the function and the culture of these places.
Manu, would you allow me to just address Wei Ying? I want to bring her into the discussion. I also attended your talk and I very much enjoyed it. One of the things that traced to me, and maybe that's not necessarily the message that you wanted to get out, is that there seems to be a difference between sort of the Japanese understanding of their own culture and heritage and sort of the international community of that, particularly in terms of its relationship to issues of modernity. Am I right in that regard? Can you elaborate a bit more on that?
Okay, I think it's absolutely right. I mean, every culture has a very has their own distinct understanding of their own modernity as opposed to the international community. I think it's fair to say. So I wouldn't say that Japan is alone in having a specific relationship to its own modernity. Everyone's set of circumstances are very different. But this sort of relates, I think, a little bit to Manu's reflections just after our talk as well, which I'd like to address actually, is how we know about social practice and, intangible heritage, as well as how do you preserve some of these things. And I think what makes Japan stand out to me is that they don't actually put stock in the physical artifacts as much as the spirit of the thing. So not many people know this, but a lot of temples get dismantled and then rebuilt on a regular basis because they realize it's not actually in the preservation of the materials, but in the spirit of the thing itself. And as we're talking about churches, I was also thinking about how, actually in Japan, they do have ceremonies in the temples, but often the ceremonies and events and celebrations take place throughout the city. So in the summer, you get, often they take the god out and they take him for a little seaside holiday. They take him through the city, parade him down to the river, and then dunk him in the river and back again. And, the whole city parades out. So it's very much interwoven in the fabric of the city. And yet also, I think what sets Japan apart is that they have it interwoven. Their social practice, their cultural practice is of appropriation and transformation and this blending of traditional and contemporary. And they've always done that. They're able to see things not as binaries, but sort of side by side and together at the same time. And it's even reflected in the language. They'll have different alphabets for different words, whether they're Japanese origin words, Chinese origin words, or Western foreign loan words, they're called. And, hiragana, katakana, and romanji. And then they'll interweave that together. And it's the same with their cuisine. And so they do this with their cultural practice. And so their cultural practice is very much alive and well. You'll get, bar owners at the end of the night sacrificing a little bit of sake to their little altar, in the bars. I remember one bar owner actually gave me some to drink as well, which was very, at the end of the night, he took it out from the little ceremonial altar and gave it to me to drink, which was lovely. So I was very blessed by their god, but these are interwoven practices. And so, they serve the community in a very embedded way. And because of that, I think they're not afraid to embrace different aspects of modernity or westernization. They're able to separate them out, but also integrate them. And this what makes them able to adopt things like, creating theme parks of Germany, a theme park of Holland. It's an appropriation, but in a fun, playful way, I suppose, which doesn't really necessarily make them scared or challenge their own identity, because they're using it to then fully materialize that and perform it, I suppose. So yeah, the social practice that we're talking about preserving is of transmutation. It is of combining. It is of being flexible and keeping the spirit of the thing, because it's not necessarily in the thing itself, it's the spirit, if that makes sense.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely. So we have a hand raised. Noha, you have a question?
Yes, I just wanted to raise another also question about the function actually of these sacred spaces. What kinds of functions that take away the sacredness from those buildings, and what kinds of activities that are allowed, or it's allowed within that sacred atmosphere? So, for example, I understand, like, for example, we have this first model of the first mosque that has been built, and it had actually a lot of functions and a lot of activities happening there. So you would find the place for the homeless people, you'd find you would also find activities running inside, like celebrations, even like meetings for the like preparing for the war and trainings. So there was a lot of activities happening, in spite the fact that it continued to be a mosque, of course. So for the church, what kinds of activities that actually could be allowed within the sacredness of what's happening, like or its architecture, and what kinds of activities that, like, for example, the bar, of course, I would imagine that's totally not like appropriate with the sacredness of the space. But what kind of activities are, if that I can ask?
So Noha, you're directing the question to all the three speakers, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Maybe Anna have an answer, or
yeah, very, very quickly, it depends on the denomination. So, for example, the Catholic churches are struggling at the moment because they are very conservative into what else they are prepared to do. So music, as Mark was saying earlier on, is one of the big ones. Concerts, yeah, they're happy with that. The Anglicans are a lot more liberal. So, for example, in St. Mary's, which is another lovely church that you may have visited in your trip to Nottingham, they even did a fashion show. So it really depends on how much they want to raise money, because that's one of the main reasons why they are more flexible, but it really depends on the denomination. Yeah.
Okay, thanks. I think Flavia has a comment, but yes.
Yeah, I can raise my hand. I think this Zoom it's not enabled the hand. So just to jump into the church conversation, which I found very interesting, in to contribute with the Brazilian cases. In Brazil, we were until recent years mostly a Catholic country, but we are moving away from this. Things are changing really quickly, and the churches are not being destroyed or being transformed. I think this is a huge taboo to put another use into churches. Very rarely they are. If so, they become museums, but this doesn't make any sense. So what happens is that they are most of the time, when there isn't a lot of use, they are reificate. How should I say this in English? Oh my God. They are monumentalized in the urban fabric, completely isolated from the daily uses, which I found very, very complicated. And they are not really into a touristic realm also, because not many people enjoy visiting churches, although we might have astonishing Baroque churches, but it's not really the case. So I'm reminded of a very interesting cartoon of the Notre Dame from Paris. And there's this bunch of tourists with going into the church, and this lady, she was praying, and then the guy, the tourist guy said, "Excuse me, you are disturbing our visit. Can you please move away?" And so this is not the case. I mean, this is a symbol of how appropriation and touristification sometimes complexify the uses in churches. But also, I loved what Nizar said about the idea of the transcendence in the spaces. You all said that. I think this is very important, because there are a lot of Afro-descendant religions that are now being considered as heritage in Brazil that are really, really struggling to be understood in their transformations. So Manu asked me about the transformations. I think they are everywhere in culture and in heritage. And in some cases, they are more radical. So they are in the Japanese culture, the transformation of the sacred places, they change a lot. And also in these Afro-descendant spaces of religion that are very, very important, very representative. But people have, in general, the specialists, the so-called specialists in heritage, have really hard time understanding these places as they are sacred spaces of value. And so I just wanted to add into the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you.
I have a question for Flavia, actually.
Yes.
Considering that museums are usually markers of a kind of canonical acceptance, would you say that these favela museums are actually sort of, what's the word, instigations of, if not rebellion, self-assertion, some kind of resistance, you know, to, because they are self-created museums, aren't they, by the favelas? So it's a kind of resistance against the canon and a kind of disruption, would you say? I'm sorry, Flavia, your mic is off.
Yeah, I thought I'm unmuted, but no, I'm sorry. I think you're right, but these museums, they are rooted in social museology tradition that was very important in France in the 60s and 70s. And as a colonized country, this idea came to Brazil, and a lot of important work and thoughts have been done in this social museology as a resistance. So how museums can be a place of political thought, of social thought, of incorporating people into the discourse. So this is a huge literature on that, indeed. And so these favela museums, they are rooted into this tradition of also eco museums and eco museums, and also the social museology, and that it's very, very strong, and it's also part of intellectual frame of Paulo Freire, which is an educator, and that the museum can be part of educational processes instead of being part of the canon. So it's quite interesting, the discussion, and they are framed into that, to answer your question.
I just want to add one thing. I think this is really interesting. What Flavia is talking about. The resistance monument, as it were, or the resistant museum, and even though it's a little bit going at a tangent, but last about 5 years ago, when I was doing a series of design studios in New Orleans, we actually encountered the fact that there was still in the lower Ninth Ward, which was the place where Katrina had hit and decimated a lot of properties, there were still these burnt out, destroyed, derelict shells of homes that were these places of resistance, similar to the favela. Of course, they were individual homes, but in the eyes of the people who lived there, and in the eyes of the other buildings that had been built around, this was a way to talk about a time that had gone by, that had as much legitimacy to be part of the canon as the other buildings had the chance to be. And I think that this actually goes back to the idea of the favela and the idea of this resistance monument that is kept there. Though I feel that here we might open I think we're opening Pandora's box a little bit too much, because we even thinking about a altogether new, different building typology as it is in some ways. So I mean, I feel that this discussion could really go on and on. I think we have about 10 minutes more. Are there any other questions that might emerge? there's actually a long question or a comment, and Anna has written something.
Sorry, yes, it's from this very interesting book, which was edited by Julio Bermúdez in 2015 about transcending architecture, and there is a chapter about social equality or social injustice, and this idea of being able to create transcendental architecture, not religious, not sacred, but just transcendental architecture that allows for anybody. And I was thinking about the favelas, this idea of, for us, that might not be the best of accommodations, but for many people, that is where they live. That's, their livelihood remains there. And it could be a possibility to create that social justice by enhancing that idea of transcendence within the favelas or any other spaces. So I just thought maybe you wanted to have that for your research.
Thank you so much, Anna. This is very generous of you. I will write it down and look upon the book. Thank you so much.
Good. Well, I think it's been a really good discussion, and I thank you again, all of you, all the presenters especially, for your wonderful papers, Anna, Huying, and Flavia, and also to the commentators, who in some ways were the interlocutors, who actually allowed for the between the lines questions to emerge and to extrapolate them. So I thank you all, and hopefully this will be the beginning of more conversations. And I look forward to meeting you in person, of course. That is my first wish. But my second wish, that over the days of this conference, maybe we'll meet each other when we attend other sessions as well. Hopefully my energies will last. It's already about 11 p.m. in my neck of the woods. But maybe one can say the night is young, and I can see if there's another session I can attend, at least in part. So look forward to seeing you all. Thank you so much again. And if there are other people who are connected and who are listening in, I think we'll all have to leave this particular Zoom room and reconnect again through the links that have been provided. Thank you all. Thank you, everyone.